Good morning to our online participants from North America, and also good evening to those joining us today from Asia. Welcome you all to today's webinar on Fintech, Big Tech, and investment vacation of China's regulatory storm. My name is Nong Hong. I am the Executive Director of the Institute for China-American Studies, an independent think tank based in Washington, D.C. Our research focuses on many of the key issues affecting or concerning the U.S.-China relations that are in great need of greater mutual understanding, including the topic on Fintech, which we'll be discussing today. This webinar is co-organized by ICAS and our partner China Program of Carter Center. It is a part of our series event of ICAS Trade and Technology Program, which was launched this summer. The goal of our TNT program is to analyze involving dynamics of U.S.-China trade and technology affairs, and also provide timely products on the issues involving the development of this topic, and also to expand the public dialogue surrounding this critical topic. We received a lot of very positive and constructive feedback on our events in July and September. Hence, we decided to host a follow-on event on this topic today. New models of internet-based finance are reshaping the finance ecosystem, as well as our life with the rise of big tech and also artificial intelligence, blockchain, and cloud computing. China is home to the world's largest fintech ecosystem today, which is dominated by giants such as Telecom, but also with a host of startups rising to fill the gaps in the underserved markets. In March this year, China President Xi Jinping stated in the ninth meeting of the Central Committee for Finance and Economic Affairs, and he remarked, I quote here, "China will establish and improve the platform economy governance system, given equal importance to development and regulation among efforts to boost fair competition, fight monopoly, and also prevent disorderly expansion of capital." So this so-called platform economy is in fact a broad label which covers technology companies and their respective arms in different sectors, including the fintech. So today's event will discuss a couple of issues, including, for instance, the fintech space in China and Asia, the motivation in the fintech space in China, and the motivation factors behind the regulatory storm, and also talk about investment implication of this Chinese technology regulations for American investors, and also the depth of sentiment against China on the Capitol Hill as the U.S. agency set up bringing Chinese company to comply with the U.S. legislative and regulatory requirements. Today's panel will be moderated by Dr. Dennis Simon. He's a senior advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke University. Dr. Simon is also a senior advisor to our Trade and Technology Program of ICAS, and has been actively participating in our previous events and contributed a lot to the development of our TNT program. Dr. Simon, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Nung, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. We welcome you, and as we go along, we'll welcome your comments and questions. Today, we originally were supposed to have 3 speakers, but Martin Krzempa had a little crisis with one of his children and has been unable to make the webinar. So we are going to focus in on our 2 speakers, Sarah Xu and Zenin Capron. And I will join them, and we hope to have a very lively dialogue. And then again, we hope to engage our audience today in a very lively Q&A. Sarah Xu right now is a clinical associate professor at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. She is also currently the CEO of China Rising Capital Forecasts, a research company focusing on the Chinese economy and financial system, and also on fintech companies. Formerly, she was an assistant professor of economics at the State University of New York at New Paltz for 8 years. This is where I also received my undergraduate education. So she and I are linked together for a long time. Her specialization is the focus on the Chinese economic development, informal finance, and shadow banking. And she has published one of the only English language books on the topic of China's informal finance, called Informal Finance in China, American and Chinese Perspectives. Our second speaker is Zenin Capron. Zenin is the founder and director of Capron Asia, one of Asia's leading providers of financial industry market research. And he works with financial institutions and technology companies to help them better understand the opportunities and the challenges in Asia's financial services industry. Prior to Capron Asia, he was the Asia Pacific Financial Industry Manager and Global Banking Industry Manager for Intel. And at Intel, he helped position and sell Intel-based architecture to financial services firms globally. And prior to Intel, he served as the CIO for Citigroup in Portugal. So you can see we have two people who really know the landscape in this particular area. And I think that we're going to have a very, very, productive discussion. Now, just as by way of context, I know most of us who follow China are very familiar with the idea that we are now engaged or have been engaged in a trade war with China. Some people sometimes call it a technology war, and there are others who are even talking about a talent war with China. But now it seems, because of recent developments over the last 18 to 20 months in particular, we're also now starting to talk about the idea of a financial war, in fact, in many ways. And I think that this is something that we want to take note of, because it has really broad ramifications, not only for the bilateral relationship, but for the entire, I think, international financial system. I was reading the other day the UNCTAD 2020 annual report on foreign investment. This is a report that gets produced every year. And the report was really conspicuous for what it noted. It said that the outflows of foreign investment from developing Asia, which includes China, fell by 19% in 2020, and that the Chinese outflow of foreign investment declined for the third year in a row. And in particular, they decided that said Chinese M&A purchases abroad decreased to the lowest in the last 10 years. So clearly, this is a response to the continued imposition of new restrictions on outward investment on the Chinese side, but also the growing geopolitical tensions between the US and China, and also the very challenging global trade and investment policy environment that China is finding itself engaged in. So we are seeing a changing landscape as we speak. And in particular, on the US side, which is really what I want to comment on this morning, we've seen some really fundamental changes that are really reconfiguring how Chinese investors are viewed, and also the strategies of these investors in terms of how they're going to conduct their business across borders over the coming years. US regulators for a long time, as we know, have been concerned about getting more transparency from Chinese companies, particularly those companies who are, have their shares being traded on US exchanges. But the problem is that Beijing has resisted in many cases, and then this has become a sort of a stalemate until the US Congress now and the SEC both have started to weigh in, as well as during the Trump administration, when a number of new policy initiatives were initiated. More than a decade ago, we know that the Chinese companies started going public, and they started to move very quickly into the United States through reverse mergers, merging into the public, and into a number of dormant US companies. And some of these turned out to be frauds. Others had other kinds of problems. And there's been an effort underway now to arrest some of these problems and to clean out some of the issues that are plaguing the investment environment. The SEC in the United States is engaged in an effort, as we know, to look at ways to get Chinese regulatory authorities to become more transparent about what's going on inside Chinese companies that list on US exchanges. As I said, this is a problem been going on for many years, but now it's gotten very serious traction because of the escalation of the issues in the trade war and also in the technology war. One particular big issue has been auditing procedures. We know that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 provided for oversight of companies so that every domestic and foreign accounting firm that issued audit reports for companies that report to the SEC, they must register with the board. And the board is required to periodically inspect these audits of U.S. public companies, including those done by foreign firms. And over time, many of these kinds of cases have been negotiated, but the Chinese companies have remained outside in many cases of these kind of deals that were made for greater transparency. Starting in 2019, the SEC began, I think, a much more aggressive stance on this, and they talked about their frustration in getting Chinese companies to be much more responsive to the need. In fact, there were terms like obstructionist that were used to respond to Chinese companies. Now, last year, we saw the passing of something called Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. It was passed by the Senate in May, and then later was passed by the House in December. And this is a very, very important act because basically what it does is that it increases the oversight. It requires companies that are publicly listed on the stock exchange to declare that they're not owned or controlled by any foreign government. And it's an amendment actually to Sarbanes-Oxley in that it requires companies to disclose to the SEC, to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, any information on foreign jurisdictions, foreign control that might prevent the kind of oversight that is required by the SEC. And such companies are banned from trading, and they're banned from listing, and they can be delisted if they're not able to have the kind of audits that are required. Now, just to give you one example of how far this has gone, in October this year, the FCC revoked the license of China Telecom to do business in the United States. And it said that the reason for revoking this license was because the company is subject to, quote, exploitation, influence, and control by the Chinese government. So you can see that there is a much more aggressive stance going on. And as of the middle of the summer, in July this year, Gary Gensler, who is the chairman of the SEC, announced that Chinese companies will need, in fact, to disclose more information to the SEC before they're allowed to sell shares or raise money from American investors. And these are focused on what are called VIEs, variable interest entities, which is a form of a shell company commonly used to get around the Chinese government's restrictions on foreign ownership and overseas listings. So what's being done on the Chinese side to escape Chinese regulatory control actually is producing a problem on this side, on the U.S. In the U.S. stock markets, and I think this is a problem. The funny thing about all of this, of course, is, as we're going to hear in a little while, as the U.S. is moving to enhance and to expand its regulatory oversight and the controls on Chinese investors, the same thing seems to be going on in China, and that Beijing has stepped up its own regulatory measures against domestic companies as well. And due to data privacy, antitrust, and other kinds of issues, as we're going to hear, Beijing now has cracked down on a whole range of companies, including private tutoring companies. And these are caught up in a somewhat changing vision that Xi Jinping has for how China is going to move ahead. Now, what's going on with these acts through the SEC are also being matched by activity on the U.S. side through CFIUS. And CFIUS, as you know, is the organization that's responsible for overseeing foreign investment in the United States. And CFIUS passed in 2018 a new regulation called FIRMA. And FIRMA is responsible for overseeing, or at least enhancing the oversight of foreign companies in the United States. It's known as the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. And it's being put in place, basically, I think, without a doubt, in particular, to look at the Chinese case, even though theoretically it is responsible for looking at all foreign companies engaged in foreign investment that might be problematic. And the FIRMA Act reflected what you might call a sense of the Congress concerning 6 very critical areas. One, the transactions that involve a country of special concern that has a strategic goal of acquiring critical technology or critical infrastructure that might affect U.S. leadership and national security. Obviously, that's a very big, broad umbrella that could allow the U.S. government to shut down almost any Chinese investment. So this is a very, very important part of this new act. The other remaining 5 are all elements that enhance the amount of control, oversight, and monitoring that the United States government has about the activities of Chinese foreign invested companies as they seek to do business in the United States. So clearly, we are in a period of intensified control and management, and all of this is being driven, I think, in many ways by the big souring, you might say, of the bilateral relationship. And the thing that is quite surprising, however, is that within the Congress, there's almost unanimous agreement that the United States must step up its oversight and must step up its control as Chinese companies continue to want to invest and take advantage. So in some ways, there's a kind of now a vice. And this vice is being pressuring Chinese firms and a lot of U.S. investors as well, I might add, from both ends, from the crackdown going on the Chinese side on one side of the Pacific and the crackdown going on the U.S. side on the other side of the Pacific. And I think this has the potential to really, as I said, alter the dynamics of the international capital and financial markets as they move ahead. So with that kind of a background in mind, and we can see the kind of rough waters we have entered, let me turn to Professor Sarah Hsu and let her make about 15 minutes of comments about the issues that she sees as important, and then we'll move on to Zenin for his comments. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. And I just want to thank ICAS and Nong Hong and Saurabh Gupta for their careful planning of this event. So China has implemented a lot of technology regulation, both fintech and non-fintech regulations. And this has caused a lot of concern for investors, and both in China and also in the US. And I think, people don't really understand what's happening. It all started last year with the crackdown with a suspension on Ant Group's IPO. And Ant Group is a spinoff of Alibaba. And so, this came after Jack Ma, the former CEO of Alibaba, made some comments that were negative about the Chinese financial system. And so then suddenly Ant Group's IPO was suspended, and Alibaba was put under an antitrust probe. And so there was a lot of speculation as to why this was happening. And at the same time, the regulator stated that Ant had to break its information monopoly over data collection. So there were issues relating to data collection, relating to privacy, and there was sort of like the whiff of something political in the air. And then the regulations didn't stop after that. And this created a constant upheaval in the stock markets, Asian stock markets, and also in some of the US stock markets that had listed Chinese shares. So, we saw then the export control law that was implemented in December 2020, and this sought to restrict exports of goods and technologies that were related to national security. So again, we see some sort of security issues, maybe something potentially political. And then in March of 2021, there were fines that were placed by the state administration for market regulation on 12 companies. So, it looked like the crackdown was spreading further and further outward. And the fines were given due to anti-monopoly violations. And these included a lot of the sort of newer technology firms, internet technology firms in China, including Baidu, Tencent, Dede, and SoftBank. They were all fined for not disclosing information about their previous investments or acquisitions or joint ventures. And then we go more specifically into fintech, where fintech companies were then ordered to follow regulations. So after the fines on the larger internet companies, then 13 fintech companies were summoned by regulators, and they were ordered to eliminate their improper links between payment tools and other financial products. They were also ordered to get rid of their monopoly. Again, we hear that word monopoly coming up on data holding, another buzzword, and also prevent other risks associated with some of their online businesses. But that didn't stop there. And so, you know, the shots just kept on coming. So in June 2021, we saw China release the data security law, and this sought to protect data, to protect national security as well as the public. And so the data, according to this law, was placed in categories of important data or national core data based on the extent to which they could threaten national security. So again, we see the rise of the national interest, national security potential threats with data. Then in July, food delivery platforms were regulated. And these are a little bit different. So the food delivery platforms were regulated because they were required to do things like improve pay, provide insurance, and also make their delivery deadlines more flexible. So to make a better working environment for their workers. So this kind of like diverged from the patterns that we saw before, which didn't help investors to interpret what was happening. You know, so we're diverging from the national security slant, the data privacy slant, and going towards social protection. And then again, also moving towards that social protection vein, we saw education technology companies that were facing restrictions on their for-profit tutoring services. And the idea was to reduce this like double burden that kids faced in terms of having a lot of homework and also on their after-school study hours in the core curriculum areas. And so again, along the lines of social protection, but specifically now social protection as interpreted by Communist Party ideology. And so that was also a shock to, I think, especially to Western investors, because you know, it seems like a matter that you know, the parents should have some sort of free choice about what the children would undertake in their spare time. But according to Communist Party doctrine, now the common prosperity ideology that we've heard, that I'll talk about in a few minutes, you know, this is the interpretation of social protection through the Communist Party. And so then again, we go back to another popular company, Tencent. Then again was fined by the same body, the State Administration for Market Regulation, which fined them according to violations in their acquisition of China Music in 2016. So we're seeing also some like going back to fining companies due to compliance issues, and why that didn't come up before. You know, it's been 5 years since 2016. Why it didn't come up before is not entirely clear, but you know, as I'll talk about, this is not completely atypical for China to have some laws on its books and not necessarily enforce them immediately. Then Dede was forced to suspend signing up new users. And this happened like 1 month after Dede was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And this really led a lot of commentators to say, you know, you should really not, as a Western investor, you should really not invest in Chinese stocks, because it looks like the government is just out to, you know, do whatever they want and maybe play tricks on Western investors. We don't know their end game, and it seems that they're doing things that are unfair in terms of their regulatory practices. And so, there's this issue there of personal data, and how does the government treat personal data? So the issue with Dede reportedly was that they collected data on their users, and they had massive amounts of data on the trips that their users took, including some government officials, where they went and what specific locations they were conducting their work in, which were supposed to be relatively secret. They also had data on mapping and traffic. And so, Dede, although it stated that it stored all of its user data in China and not on overseas servers, there was a concern that these government secrets could potentially get out on this secret information or confidential information. And then just after that, technology companies were required to submit to a cybersecurity checkup before going public on overseas stock exchanges. So it didn't end there. I'll just talk about a couple of other things because the laundry list is getting really long. In August, China cracked down on algorithms. And again, this was this idea that consumers needed to be protected, and algorithms were banned that recommended content to customers to increase the amount of time or money that the customers spend on specific pages. So something that's really common in the US and in the West, this practice has been banned in China because it can cause potential customer addiction or excessive spending. So again, this idea of social protection as viewed from the lens of the Communist Party. Then the same month, China released its personal information protection law, and this sought to protect citizens' data. It specifically prevented firms from transferring personal data abroad. So again, we see a common theme with the data, with the Chinese government trying to protect national security and prevent that data from going abroad. And then the final thing that I'll talk about, although there have been a couple of more developments with LinkedIn pulling out of China, Yahoo pulling out of China, but in terms of regulations, the government has cracked down on online activity in China, and it's reduced the number of hours that children under 18 would be allowed to play online video games to 3 hours per week. So 3 hours per week for kids to play video games. Seems pretty harsh, especially to a lot of us in the US. So why was this happening? There's no one reason that's been given for all of these different regulations. They've all been given with different kinds of justifications. And observers can only speculate as to the real underlying reasons for these regulations. But one of them, the most obvious is that, China wants to curb some of the illegal activity. So some of the things that just should not have been happening, like having an illegal insurtech business. That is something that can actually really harm people because it's fraudulent finance. And this is something that China has struggled with combating for years, is that there are companies that set up business and they're not legally allowed to do that. That makes sense. Some of the other ones are a little bit more challenging to wrap our heads around. The other reason that's been really commonly given is guaranteeing national security. So whatever that means, the comings and goings of public officials, I think, could be justified in terms of national security. But China has really cracked down on the transfer of data abroad. And so that goes along the lines of the U.S.-China technology, some people have referred to it as a Cold War, but just some sort of conflict there. Another idea, that has been proposed for these new regulations is the idea of common prosperity. So this is an ideology that Xi Jinping has come up with in recent years. And the idea is that prosperity should not be enjoyed just by a few people, but it should be enjoyed by the vast majority of society. So how do we protect people? How do we provide public stability? And so there's this idea that some of these regulations, like reducing video game playing hours, can help to protect the public and make them better citizens. Another idea is that, it's part of the normal regulatory pattern, which to some extent you could justify that it is. China has tended to allow certain industries to run, like it did allow the shadow banking industry to run for a long time before cracking down and implementing regulations that would eliminate a lot of illegal activity or shadowy activity. It did the same thing to fintech companies. And it's pretty much, threw a bomb into the peer-to-peer lending industry within fintech. And so, there's this idea that the government allows these industries to run for a long time and then sees what risks have arisen, and then finally places all of these regulations on these industries to crack down suddenly. So that's another possibility. Some Chinese firms have tried to get ahead of the game by censoring themselves or regulating themselves. So for example, one company, and it's certainly not alone in doing this, so KE Holdings, which is the biggest platform in China for matching buyers and sellers of real estate, shut down its VIP services. And the company was already being investigated for antitrust violations, so it was kind of trying to get ahead of the game. We've seen in other cases that the CEOs of major companies have made really large philanthropic donations to different organizations to try to look like they're really in favor of promoting common prosperity. And so, what we can make out from all of these regulations that have come down the pipeline is that there are lots of short-term costs, certainly, like shutting down a whole arm of your business or not being able to have your IPO carried out, in a surprise moment. Those impose large short-term costs on the companies. And there's this idea that these regulations could exchange the short-term costs for long-term stability. That's, what I think, China is ultimately trying to go for. And so then, the question is that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more in the session is, where do we go in terms of understanding what China's doing in its innovation? Chinese policy has been really focused on promoting innovation, including in the fintech sector and the internet sectors. But which areas are safe? We're not entirely sure, and it seems like a time of great uncertainty for investors to understand which sectors are safe from additional regulation. We also know that there's additional regulation coming down the pipeline for the next 5 years because China has passed another regulation stating that there would be a lot more regulations, including of the technology sector and also of monopolies, amongst other areas. And so, we have to really understand how this affects US investors. So no doubt, US investors have become really nervous over these increasing costs. Do I invest in Chinese stocks? Are these now a buy because their price has fallen? Or should I just steer clear of them because the risk is too high? And so I think that's something that investors have really, really struggled with. And as Dennis mentioned, Dennis referred to a lot of these issues. The backdrop is that the US and China have been in a trade war for some time. And so technology and also intellectual property issues, think, data security, these issues have really become center stage. So they're on the front of the minds of Chinese policymakers. And it's something that is likely to be ongoing just because of the continuing tensions and trade wars and all the developments of new technologies that have come on board, artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, big data, and so on, has increased risks that are present in some of these industries. So I'm running out of time, but I'll just quickly mention, repeat what Dennis said to some extent, that US SEC has highlighted some of the risks that are associated with Chinese firm disclosures. Some of the investment disclosures can be viewed as incomplete or misleading. And the SEC has also considered a new standard that would disqualify the audit work by accounting firms that are located in places like China, because they have found them not to be necessarily independent of the companies that they are auditing, which is the biggest no-no in the auditing industry. That's another major concern. And then there's the issue that Dennis also mentioned for variable interest entities. These are basically ways for Chinese firms in particular industries, especially in the tech industry, to get foreign investment and list overseas by creating a shell company. And so this structure has kind of a gray status in China. Apparently, the Chinese regulators are reviewing this structure. And so the fact that the Chinese companies that are listing overseas have these somewhat, shadowy structures does not comfort Western investors. So, there are other things that we can talk about, but I will go ahead and hand it back to Dennis, who will then give some time for Zenin to talk.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah. A really good overview of the lay of the land as things exist now. So now let's turn it over to Zenin. And the audience may have noticed, fortuitously, Martin has been able to join us. Two good pieces of news. One, he's here, but more importantly, his child is okay. So he's been given the approval to join us. So after Zenin speaks, we will go to Martin for his comments then. Zenin, it's up to you.
Great, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Sarah. I think, between the two of you, you've done an amazing job of laying out the land in China and kind of the situation on the ground there. I guess the couple of points that I could add around the edges to that, I think Sarah's done a really good job of mapping out kind of the trajectory of this regulation in China and how it's developed over the years. I think what's useful to put in context is how impactful some of these platforms were, which only kind of makes the impact of what the Chinese government doing even greater than it may seem on the surface. I'm sure many of you on this webinar have seen the results of the Ant Group and what they've done. And I was based in China for about 14 years. And I arrived in 2004 when Alipay and WeChat Pay launched, and I left in 2018. And I tell the story of when I first got to China, in order to pay my rent, because I couldn't take out more than a couple $100s from the ATM, I would have to go to the teller in my bank. I would have to withdraw the money, which is about $1,000 US for my rent. I would have to walk it across the street and deposit it in my landlord's account. Such were the state of payment systems in 2004, such that if I wanted to make that transfer, I would have had to fill out a significant amount of paperwork and pay a large fee to do that. When I left in 2018, I was paying my staff using Alipay. I was covering expenses and splitting the bill with friends using WeChat Pay, and I had invested in an investment product from Baidu, which is the Google of China. So over the course of just even the 14 years that I was in China, there was a tremendous change and impact for even me as a foreigner living there on my lifestyle. It made it very easy, such that my use of cash was very little by the end of the time that I was there. Eventually, the rules tightened up such that foreigners couldn't borrow or invest on these platforms, but still using them pretty much every day. And so that, that brings a couple of different angles. I mean, the first is that there is a credible amount of data that goes across these platforms, as had been hinted earlier on in this webinar, that the question of data right now in China, and in particular around consumer data, is very important. And when you have a platform that is, on the Alipay platform, or the WeChat Pay platform, you can book taxis, you can order food, you can pay bills, you can top up your mobile phone. I mean, I worked for Citibank for 5 years, and a couple of years ago, 15 years after I left the bank, they sent me a note and they said, "We realize you've left the bank and we're taking away your employee privileges." If my bank that I worked for after 15 years can't understand that I'm still an employee, how are they going to understand the individuals? And so when you look at the implications for that, for providing financial services to the underserved in China, which are manyfold, that's really where these platforms came into play. It started off with payments. It started off with, Alipay was designed to solve the issue of trust in e-commerce, expanded into mobile payments, and expanded into QR codes that we know today, and then additional financial products and services like wealth management and lending on top of that. Now, for the average individual in China who may only need a couple of thousand of renminbi or a few $100s of a loan, it would be very difficult to go to a bank and access that kind of capital. Indeed, when we were in Hangzhou a couple of years ago, Ant Group is one of our clients, we stumbled across a scooter salesman who had a small shop, a very humble shop that had, at any point, he was selling kind of 4 or 6 of these electric scooters. These are kind of scooters that you would buy for $300 and you maybe sell for $500. His turnover every month was probably a few $1,000s, which, I mean, he was doing quite well for himself in that. But for him to go to the bank and say, borrow the equivalent of $10,000 would have been nearly impossible. To evaluate a loan and to issue a loan in China, based on studies that we've done, it costs about approximately $250 US dollars to assess a loan application to make a loan. So if you're borrowing something like $1,000, you can forget about it because that loan nearly immediately is unprofitable for the bank. So there's this entire set of individuals and SMEs that were excluded from the traditional financial ecosystem. In many ways, Alipay and WeChat Pay provided that access to financial products and services. That individual that I mentioned, Mr. Joe, who was there with his scooter repair shop, he was, when you go into a shop, he had 2 QR codes on the wall where he would accept Alipay payments and WeChat Pay payments. And over the course of a couple of months, Alipay and Ant Group get a feel for what his transactions are like, the money that's coming in. He was also paying suppliers with Alipay as well. So you get a feel for who that borrower could be. Over the course of the next 3 months after that, he built up a credit line with one of the Ant Group financial products of about 15,000 US dollars in credit on that platform. And as probably has been reported and many people know, there's this model of 3-1-0, the idea that Jack Ma had of it takes 3 minutes to apply for a loan, it takes 1 second for that money to be dispersed, and there's 0 people involved in that transaction. So effectively, this individual had an unsecured credit line of $15,000, which is incredible for somebody who's running a business like that. But it enabled him to stop borrowing from friends and family and to expand his business. So the impact of these, for myself, being a foreigner was already quite high. For other people living in first-tier, second-tier cities, who may be white-collar individuals working in office jobs, they're using it every day, but we often forget about the financially excluded in the 3rd or 4th-tier cities or in the economic areas that don't have as many opportunities as in the main cities. So that the impact, although it hasn't been measured in terms of the impact on GDP, it would be reasonable to assume that it was a couple of tens of basis points adjustment or additive to China's GDP over the course of the time that Alipay was launched. So it had a tremendous impact, and that I think was part of the reason that the government didn't immediately crack down on these platforms. But it does go to show that how serious the government is about the crackdown here. In many ways, when you think about the brands that have recognition outside of China's borders, outside of Ant Group and maybe Air China and ICBC, you might know Hire Group, but there's most of the other conglomerates in China. You wouldn't know their brand name unless you were in China because they have such a small brand internationally. And China was really known for the tech, from Alibaba to Ant Group to Tencent to Baidu to all of the other platforms that have developed in China. To see them essentially cut these platforms off at the knees is really telling about how serious they are in this crackdown. And I think, as was mentioned before, this is probably only the start of what we're seeing. And the implications for investors are fairly stark. much like property in China was seen as a one-way bet, betting on Chinese tech stocks, whether they be peer-to-peer lenders or some of the big players like the Alibabas and Baidus, seemed to be a one-way bet in an economy that could only continue to grow. But these last actions have brought a lot more unpredictability into that. If you had asked me 2 or 3 years ago when I was living in China, would the government crack down on these platforms? And I would have said no. I think the benefits to the economy and to the populace have been so great. But apparently my opinion doesn't matter in China as much, and they have, which is telling again of the seriousness with this. So I think it's just that context kind of puts this a little bit more in how important and how impactful these regulations are. So let me pause there and I'll pass it back to Dennis.
Great, thanks very much. That was great. That's a great addition to what Sarah and I put on the table. And now let's turn to Martin. I didn't get a chance to fully introduce Martin, so let me just take a minute to do that. Martin is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. He gained his financial innovation knowledge while in Germany as a Fulbright scholar and also as a researcher within German banks. He also conducted research on financial liberalization in Beijing, first as a Luce scholar at Dede, Peking University, and then at the China Finance 40 Forum, one of China's leading independent think tanks. In 2017, he graduated from the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government with a master's degree in public administration and international development. And he's working on a forthcoming book now on fintech in China. So let me turn over the floor to Martin, and you have about 12 or 13 minutes, and see what you can add to what's already been put on the table. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, and I'm really glad I was able to join despite the incredibly hectic morning I had to go through with kiddo. So I think Sarah covered in quite in depth the overall crackdown that's going on. So instead of going through the individual elements of it, I'd like to step back a little bit and provide some views on how I make sense of what's happening in China. So the first thing is that I think pressure has long been building inside China to end what I've called a Wild West under an authoritarian regime. In the fintech space, but also in the internet space, there's generally been very little regulation, just as Sarah alluded to, and regulators work often behind many years the innovations and size of the markets that were being created by technology companies and the private sector. Of course, one exception to that is censorship. But outside of censorship, I think that the regulations were quite loose. But progress was quite slow. And one reason for that is that these companies had immense political power. And also they could credibly say that they're, as Zenin alluded to, they were providing enormous benefits to China's economy and really provided the basis for the build out of China's incredibly innovative digital economy and the whole ecosystems around that. I mean, I don't think we would have many of these innovative companies if it weren't for Alipay and Tencent Pay. But then right before the Ant Group IPO, which was going to be the largest in the world, Jack Ma makes this disastrous speech criticizing regulators, and that changed the political cost benefit of tech regulations in an important way. It exposed the fact that Jack Ma was out of touch with the current political environment in China. First of all, and secondly, it made him look like a dangerous oligarch who was trying to block important regulations needed for financial stability to benefit his own company. And that, I think, is what changed the political cost benefit of tech regulations, led us to this Politburo statement in December, which said that they need to enhance anti-monopoly and stop the quote, disorderly expansion of capital. Yet, there's been some narrative in much of the media that this is just kind of, at least initially, that this was a retaliation against Jack Ma and, a kind of a threat to everybody not to speak up anymore, and that many of these were rushed out. And while I think some of these have been rushed out, especially including the tutoring ban that Sarah mentioned, overall, I look at things like the data protection law and some of the fintech regulations, and these are things that have been debated in some cases for a decade or more. So these in many cases were carefully thought out, sensible regulations from a public policy perspective that just weren't able to come out until the political economy was right. So just the fact that there's been this barrage of them doesn't mean that they're, none of that is being thought through, but that the political economy has changed. So a sort of dam has broken. Many of the specific goals and policies in this crackdown, as it's often referred to, would probably be welcomed in the United States and Europe. Some of the ideas about lack of banning just price discrimination in algorithms would probably be quite welcome. The ability to move your data around from platform to platform, data portability, the requirement of more consent from internet platforms to use your data and in a different way. Much of this would actually probably be quite great if we implemented it in the United States. Obviously not forcing algorithms to push positive energy Communist Party content onto the top of a feed, but some of the other elements I think are quite shared, and thus, although it creates a lot of uncertainty for investors, may not actually be such a bad thing. And the way I see this the situation is constantly evolving, and I'll get into a little bit of why. But I really see this as a potential shift to a new regime of regulation, one that could end up reaching some sort of equilibrium that is durable in the way that the previous equilibrium was not really durable because it was just too low regulation for China and probably too low regulation, honestly, for even a Western country to accept. But that means that the uncertainty is going to exist for a while, but not necessarily for an extremely long time. We might actually have a shift. So why? Then next I want to go into some of the politics that are behind this campaign. So the length of the campaign and the extent, which sectors are going to get hit are unknown. I highly doubt that there's some master plan among the Politburo and Zhongnanhai that has a list of who the next targets are and all of that. The way my mental model of how China's government works is that these high-level guidance like common prosperity, dual circulation, disorderly expansion of capital, they are very high level and don't really provide that much content of exactly what that means in practice. And there are always multiple of these slogans coming around at the same time. You could add another one, which is new development concept that Xi Jinping has pushed. So, but then what happens is the individual regulators want to show that they're aligned with and implementing the leaders' overall blueprint, and they do this in a sort of trial and error function, where they're trying to figure out how far is too far, how far is not far enough. So I don't think we quite know exactly what it's going to look like in each sector, because I don't even think the regulators quite know. They have to see what the effect of what they're doing is and watch how the politics in the Politburo change. And this is consistent, as Sarah alluded to again earlier, with long-standing patterns in China's political economy, where you have campaign-style crackdowns after years of lax regulation. But also the timing is quite consistent in that this is a really important party congress coming up in about a year, one that is likely to break with precedent and appoint Xi Jinping to a third term as general secretary, and that to justify that he needs to come up with an ambitious campaign that provides in a way the justification for the break with precedent, to say I need to be in power for another term so that I can realize this, all of these things, common prosperity, dual circulation, all the national security, and really get the tech sector in line and boosting China's development interests. And also for about a decade now, the Chinese government has pushed more for a granular industrial policy instead of overall visions, has been getting more into the weeds. And that's something that Barry Naughton has called grand steerage. And I think his work is useful to reference if you're interested in this. I think that we're still in the very early innings of this crackdown because there's another year until the Party Congress. I think that once the Party Congress is done, we'll have more of a sense of what this campaign in the end will look like. But I want to conclude with, this is talking about what the implications are for foreign investors. One of the interesting things in this crackdown has been that there's a huge decline in the value of the publicly traded major internet platforms, especially those that are listed on foreign exchanges. But at the same time, the venture capital and early stage funding for companies in China is looking like it's going to be a record year, which you might not expect considering the crackdown on Ant and all these new regulations. You'd think maybe the VCs would be sitting on the sidelines, not investing in anything until the dust settles. But instead, they're pouring money into these companies. And so if you're talking about a foreign investor who's investing in private companies in China, or those who are not listed abroad, they've faced much less of a negative consequence of these regulations, whereas foreign investors in the big companies like Alibaba and others have not as much. And in a sense, that's just a function of the size of these companies. They're huge targets for anti-monopoly regulation and all of the others. And another interesting pattern in that venture capital data is that the smart money that's putting new money into startups in China is not putting it into the companies that look like Alibaba and Tencent. They're putting them into more hard tech. They're talking biotech, enterprise software, and these other areas where Beijing actually wants the money to go. And domestic investors have been receiving these signals loud and clear and putting their money aligned with those government objectives, and thus have faced less of a negative effect. Whereas foreign investors who might not know that much about China instead have been hit harder because they're not able to quite follow the tea leaves in the same way. So with that, I will conclude and look forward to question and answer.
Super. Thank you very much. And again, the valuable addition to the picture that we see evolving here in the future. Let me start with a question. And Martin, you touched on it, but Jack Ma, to what extent is Jack Ma, in fact, a lightning rod for a lot of what's going on? I used to be the president of Monitor Group China, and we actually had Alibaba as one of our clients. And in those days, even though Jack had a kind of vision, he didn't seem to be such a powerful personality in many ways. But all of a sudden, over the last dozen years or so, both as a function of the bat kind of grouping that we've seen, he seems to have taken on a more audacious kind of presence. Do you think that if Jack kind of just sort of withers away a little bit, that some of this will go away, or is this really a much more pronounced effort to really change the game fundamentally? Who wants to take that one on? Martin?
I'm happy to start that. So yeah, I do think he's a lightning rod, but I think that the way to think about it is that the political economy of this has been shifting for a while. So you think of the 996 worker culture at these companies that was just accepted as normal, even though it was totally illegal under China's labor laws. That's something that faced a lot of pushback and eroded the public support for these companies. Another is, the treatment of the delivery drivers who form in many ways the backbone of the quick delivery that a lot of these services rely upon. Another is just more generally the sense of, the party wanting to get more control over what they consider to be critical infrastructure in China. Alipay and its platform, and WeChat and its platform are more like critical infrastructure in a sense in China. Everything is built on top of them, these mini programs and the payment functions and all of that. So I think even if you don't have a Jack Ma, you would still have these kind of rules. The way I think about it is Jack Ma's speech accelerated a process that was quite inevitable in the first place. And what's interesting is that Jack Ma had kind of disappeared a bit from the public sphere before that speech. So I think, the 2013-14 Jack Ma was swashbuckling. He was coming out and attacking the banks, attacking people, really common. But I think he recognized that that was getting a little more dangerous in the new era. And it's a bit of a conundrum why he decided to make this speech. at this time, because I do think that the counterfactual of no speech is Ant does an IPO at a $313 billion valuation, and regulators have a harder time cracking down on that company in the short term, because it would lead the stock to crash, and people would make the accurate statement, why didn't you get the regulation right before you allowed the thing to IPO? And that would also affect retail investors in China that would have gone through. So I still think you would have seen all these measures, but probably watered down a bit and later if it hadn't been for his lightning rod function.
Sarah, do you want to add something to that?
I mean, I generally agree with Martin, and I think some of the regulations would have been coming down the pipeline. It's just that they have different types of justifications. There's this overall view of common prosperity and the idea that, China wants to make sure that kids are not playing video games for too long. They also want to make sure that companies aren't too big and that your data is protected. It's a lot really to take in all at once. But given the backdrop of the U.S.-China technology conflict, it does make sense. I mean, I can certainly understand how China views data as a potential weapon. When you know that China has been looking at data as another factor of production. So they've added it as a factor of production to the typical factors of production, land, labor, and capital. Now data, it can also be, changed and used against a country. And so I think, in light of that, it does make sense. But all at once and with different types of justifications, has created a climate of huge uncertainty about what's going to come next. And it's basically common prosperity as viewed through the lens of the Communist Party, which we as Westerners often cannot quite well interpret.
Zenin, do you have a thought on this one?
Not beyond what's said. I think both Sarah and Martin covered it very well.
Okay, let me pick up on another point that was raised, and that is innovation. This is something that I spend a lot of time on, and it's obviously this area of fintech was one of the areas, particularly in terms of business model innovation, that we looked at China and say, okay, as Martin said, we may not know so many Chinese brands in terms of product technology, i.e., the Chinese iPhone equivalent is really not from Huawei. It just didn't seem to make it, So, but we do know about Alipay, and we do know about WeChat, and we do know about all of these. And it seems that Xi Jinping has kind of thought about this and said, this is not a strong leg to stand on for the Chinese economy going forward. We need hardware rather than software. And we need, it's sort of like back in the late 70s, early 80s when China was importing technology. There were those that said China should import know-how, and there are those that said China should import whole plants and equipment. And they had this debate, about hardware things versus software. Well, this seems to be the same thing. Xi Jinping sort of says, these are not semiconductors. These are not quantum computers. These are not the kinds of things that you build a leading country on, and that he's trying to really switch in a very fundamental way the locus of innovation away from this kind of business model innovation towards much more of a hardware orientation. Do you see some of that happening, any of you? And do you see that that's something that may be with us for a while? Anyone? You raise your hand rather than me calling on you. Martin?
Yeah, I think that's right. I would also expand it beyond hardware and say, what is the software? So if it's an algorithm which is pushing a delivery driver to get you a latte 30 seconds faster, I don't think they think that's a useful way of spending a Tsinghua computer science graduate's time. But if it's a way to software that better improves data analytics for some medium-sized company to make sense of its data and improve its production processes, or become more efficient, I think that say enterprise software, I think that element could be very much encouraged. So it's more like a consumer internet. And I think that's actually in some sense kind of justified, because you can look at what's happened so far and say, they made immense progress from, Zenin was talking about this with the progress that they made in improving the convenience of the financial sector, but they've done this all across the economy. There really isn't that much left, right, in the consumer space compared to some of these other areas, and in some cases when they expand to something, there's a recognition that when these big tech companies enter a space, they go in an all-out subsidy war, which can benefit some people, but it really screws over the incumbents in that area. So group buying was one of the more interesting recent ones, where it's like all these local poor vegetable sellers and people who are on the bottom of the income distribution who rely on this are getting undercut and priced by these big platforms just providing huge subsidies so that people buy it. That's not really necessarily innovation. I think you look at the food delivery wars in the United States, for example, and say it's not necessarily real technical innovation. Maybe the same thing with Uber, and so I would think that distinction is going to be quite important, but expand just a little bit on not just software.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think that, to some extent, I would agree that it certainly seems safer to invest in areas of hard technology, like industrial internet, maybe, and away from like consumer-based types of applications. But I think that, the direction of the policy has changed. I mean, for a long time, China was really promoting a lot of these fintech firms because they were helping to advance the policy of inclusive finance. And so, now things have changed since those companies have gained more power. And now data is viewed as a critical factor of production. And it's become a topic of national security protection to the extreme. And so I think, it could be that this area matters even more for China than it ever has, but that the policy direction is changing so that it's less consumer oriented, as Martin mentioned, and it should be more towards this idea of common prosperity, whatever it is. Certainly we've seen Xi Jinping extol the value of the digital currency as well as blockchain-based applications. So I don't think there's really a strong move away from those types of applications, but how it's used certainly matters in terms of policy.
Okay, great. Why don't we go to our audience and take a couple questions? Here's one. What impact will the new Beijing stock market have, the Beijing Stock Exchange have on the current situation? And will its regulations stray from further Western institutions, or will it be regulated in a way to entice foreign investors, particularly those coming from the West?
I can say a few words about that. But if you look within the financial industry in general, over the past few years, the government has become much more open for the involvement of foreign companies in capital markets in China and indeed payments as well. When you look back at what China agreed to in the WTO agreements in 2001, we only really saw that opening of the banking market in probably 2006 or 2007, when foreign institutions like HSBC and Citibank could actually set up branches and deal in renminbi transactions. And so that was something that was promised and probably delivered 5 to 6 years later. Similarly, the government has talked about reforming and opening up the capital markets. And over the past couple of years, we've seen a lot of push around that. I mean, obviously we had the QFI program, the QDII program that enabled investment in both directions in and out of China. And the other thing that we've seen in the past couple of years in the capital market side is allowing more foreign companies to set up basically branches and services in China as well. So actually the capital market side of the equation is really one area of the financial industry and in general that the government has been relatively open for. I think, looking specifically at the Beijing Stock Exchange, my concern, a question around that, I'm sure Martin has views on this, is more the symbolism of setting up an exchange. I mean, when you look at capital markets trading today, you know, the stock exchange could be in my basement. It doesn't really matter because everything's done electronically anyways, right? So the location from a technology perspective and an execution perspective is pretty irrelevant in these days. But by Beijing saying, okay, we're going to set up a Beijing exchange, in my mind, that's actually a bit of a power play by both the provincial and the national government to make Beijing a little bit more of a financial center as well as the political center. And I would just say in the last point, I think, you know, Beijing will do everything it can to make that successful. So if there are ways of enticing foreign investors to help support some of the companies that are being listed on there, they'll do that. Now, that has not always been successful in the past. I mean, we've seen some of the Shanghai boards and the New Growth Board, the uptake hasn't been as great as they likely would have hoped. So that will be a challenge. But for me, it's not so much the cross-border aspect of things, it's what it means domestically.
Right, right. Okay. Let's move on. There's another question, of course, about blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies. So what does it look like is going to happen actually here in China with respect to both blockchain and cryptocurrencies? Will the current new area of restriction be placed on mining in China in a way that will constrain the development of these particular types of technology? Sarah? Okay, Sarah, and then Martin.
Martin, you can. Okay, so sorry. Yeah, so I would just say it looks like China does not like cryptocurrencies at all, but it's going towards other types of blockchain technologies, basically anything that requires a trusted connection, like supply chain finance is a big area in which China is using blockchain technologies. They've also developed the Blockchain Service Network, which is a national network that blockchain companies can use to connect with other firms. And so there are many, many other applications of blockchain outside of cryptocurrencies that China is looking to use, including in the sovereign digital currency area. And in that area, this is a type of technology that does not require blockchain per se, but there are lots of fintech applications that can use blockchain to make use of the sovereign digital currency.
So before Martin answers, let me add, there's another question related to this that maybe Martin also can comment on. And that is that as these use of blockchain and digital currencies spread in China, there seems to be some concern in the West that China may become the country that actually writes the rules of the road for some of these burgeoning technologies. That in fact, that the alignment between the way China looks at these, as Sarah said, and the way the West looks at these is very, very different. And therefore, if China were to go in a big way in these areas, that also could perhaps have a very disruptive effect on international financial markets, et cetera. Do you see any of that happening, or do you see the skittishness actually being a healthy constraint in terms of the kind of influence that this person is suggesting might occur?
Yeah, so I'm not worried about this area at all. From a US policy perspective, I've been pushing back against a lot of the panic about the digital renminbi. I think it's not shown itself yet to be cheaper, faster, more secure way of doing payments. I think that you're still going to have capital controls, which are the main constraint, and a non-independent central bank. So no one's going to really have renminbi reserves in the same way as they have US dollar reserves, because when things are going crazy in the markets and you actually need to get the money out, you have to realize that China can flip the circuit breaker and keep your money in. So I'm not, whether the money is digital. By the way, all the money that's actually moved, that's big money, is already digital too. In the blockchain space, to the first of the question on mining is totally dead in China. It's all moved to Texas and somewhere else. These rules that came out, a month or two ago, are so strict that if you're even doing anything on a technical level to support cryptocurrency transactions, you can go to jail. So it is extremely draconian, and to the extent that the U.S. sees an opportunity to actually attract many of these companies here, I don't think anybody is so. Maybe the analogy to think of would be Europe has kind of become the de facto regulator for a lot of data side because of the GDPR, but I don't really see China becoming the Europe of digital currency here, because they just banned pretty much it all. And in every case where there's no cryptocurrency, but there's a blockchain, I always say, why do you need the blockchain? If you have a trusted central intermediary, you have a database, and you can share that database. And you don't need a blockchain, because everybody, you have a few trusted parties who are permissioned and operating, and you have a database. So that's what the digital renminbi is. The PBOC handles the ledger that controls, and verifies who owns what, and different banks and payment companies will submit transactions to it, and it will tell them what the definitive version of the thing is. So I see all this blockchain hype in China, and I say, what's the point other than PR? So I have yet to see the blockchain killer app. I have yet to see a decentralized application that actually works. Of course, I'm open to alternative explanations, because Zenin literally wrote the book on Bitcoin in China, which I read, and you all should too. It's called Chomping at the Bitcoin. I'll do his book promo for him. But it's really, really useful in helping kind of contextualize it. So I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Okay, let's take one more question. Major Western companies like LinkedIn and Yahoo have now pulled out of China recently. Is this trend likely to continue, and will it bleed into other areas of fintech, and we'll start to see a more broader exodus? What's your sense of the future?
I remember when I first arrived to China, I was working for Intel, and our clients they didn't buy directly from Intel, but obviously from HP, Dell, Lenovo, these kind of companies, the banks. And one of the things that I had heard is that Microsoft, actually most of their revenue from China was just getting people to pay for the licenses that they already used rather than actually buy new licenses. And so for the first 4 or 5 years of Microsoft's foray into China, it was really just trying to enforce licensing. And that initially did not really sit well with the Chinese government. I mean, they kind of did even then recognize the need for IP and to pay for licenses and things. But the approach that Microsoft used was a little bit at odds with what the Chinese government was looking for. Over the course of the following 5 years, Microsoft invested heavily into R&D across China. They set up the R&D centers in Shanghai, Beijing, Chengdu, and invested heavily in the country and de-emphasized the need or this kind of enforcement campaign that they're running. And that really changed the fortunes of Microsoft in China, insofar that the companies actually started to pay licenses, and their business grew. And I think there's a valuable lesson in there. I think with a lot of these foreign companies that come into China, if there's not a clear benefit for the Chinese people one could argue that LinkedIn has a certain benefit, but if the risks outweigh the benefits, then the Chinese government in certain ways would cut off access to the market. And when it presents too much risk, obviously, many platforms that are just blocked in China, like YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, et cetera. So I think, with LinkedIn and Yahoo, on any investor presentation, on any financial report, China has to be part of the strategy, or at least it used to have to be part of the strategy. And shareholders and investors would ding or would devalue a company that wasn't looking at China. So I think for many years, these companies just burned a tremendous amount of capital in China without making much progress, because they kind of had to, because the investors were pushing in that direction. And so I think this exodus that we're seeing is just, you have to hit a point that if you're not making revenues in there, you abate, right, and you move on to countries where you are.
Right. Well, there's a saying in China business, bad business practice elsewhere doesn't automatically become good business practice in China. And a lot of companies did things in China that they would never do elsewhere in the world because, quote unquote, it was China. So I think that this is something that we have to remember when we think about some of these things. Well, let me make one overarching comment before we close. It seems to me that one constant theme among the three of you has been the unpredictability of what we've seen in many ways. While we can take different facets of Xi Jinping's so-called new agenda, whether it's common prosperity or dual circulation, etc., it reminds me of the description of the reform program. Sometimes, people have asked what has been the strategy of reform in China, and the description has been, it's like crossing the river by feeling the stones. And it's kind of saying that there's not really been a clear, definitive strategy. Kind of you do a little bit, you see if it works, and you do a little bit more. And I like that one of you made the comment that the policymakers now are not really sure how far to take this. Who are the next list of companies to be reined in? Which ones specifically are going to be reined in? That agenda really doesn't get set very easily by the big, broad macro concepts that have been articulated by President Xi and the other 6 members of the Standing Committee. I think that we're going to have to see where this all is going to end up. But it's very clear, and from listening to the three of you, that you see a kind of new agenda coming online, and that agenda is going to be the justification for what happens at the next Party Congress in terms of President Xi being able to stay around for a third term, and whether or not that's the necessary glue that's going to be able to get the support needed to continue in place is a real question. I think that it's almost a foregone conclusion that that's going to happen. But the question is how much damage might have been done to what we once saw as the most innovative, cutting edge of the Chinese economy, now that it's been reined in and it's now encountering a whole new series of constraints. And I think as we go forward, this is going to remain one of those areas that we need to keep very close track of and see how this is going to affect the bigger picture. So let me thank the three of you for really a wonderful series of presentations, and your comments and responses to the audience questions just were really spot on. And I thank you, and let me thank the Institute for China-American Studies and the Carter Center in Georgia for their co-sponsorship of the program and organizing this. And I would urge you to follow the website of the Institute for China-American Studies so that you can see when the next programs will come about in the coming future. So again, thank you all for your participation, and we'll see you next time around. Good morning and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, for being such a great moderator, leading us to this very terrific discussion among our three speakers, very distinguished three speakers. So again, I would like to join Dennis for thanking Sarab, Zenin, and Martin, particularly for sharing your expertise. And I believe your background, you have a common background, which either you have working in the sectors related to Chinese market on this topic, or we're doing research or teaching in China. I think that's a great benefit to our audience online. So again, thank you very much. And I would like to also thank our online participants joining us for today's discussion, and particularly to those from Asia who stayed very late with us. Again, thank you all, and looking forward to seeing everyone again very soon. Thank you.